professional development day that we have.
Okay.
That's 1 of 5.
Let's pick it back up. We've got about 30 minutes, and then we'll take a break again for our speaker. Okay, so the article that I had you guys read was this article by John Cotter called "Leading Change: Why Transformation Efforts Fail." And like I said, you know, Cotter is the godfather of this research area, and the key elements in this successful change processes really come from him. So if you look on page, it's probably page 4 of the article, you know, he lays it out. Establishing a sense of urgency, forming a powerful guiding coalition, creating a vision, communicating, empowering others to act, blah, 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 blah. So I think you guys have started to see the reoccurring theme. This type of systematic approach is mentioned quite often. Sometimes the titles are a little bit different. Sometimes it's about aligning incentives. In this case, he used the term empowering others to act. But you know, what I really want in this class is not for you guys just to be able to regurgitate this academic list. That's easy to do. I mean, so I'll bump into people and they'll say, "Oh, you're teaching a class at Richmond. What's it about?" "Oh, it's about leading change." "Oh, well, what do you talk about?" I'll say, "Oh, well, you know, basically I talk about how to establish urgency, form, you know," and I can just regurgitate it to them. But that doesn't really communicate anything. And so, again, the reason why I'm here is because I'm not an academic. I'm not a PhD. I'm not a professor. I'm a real business person. And so I want you guys to come away with a lot more details and plans on how you can do this. So I had you read this article because I think it fit well with the progression of the course. I think it complemented the book, Who Killed Change, because, again, we're talking about why something failed. And it seems like in this particular area, change management, it's almost easier to learn from the failures than the successes. But what I'd like to do is spend a little bit more time and not so much talking about conceptually things like urgency, but more talking about how do you as an individual empowered with a change program in front of you, how do you actually step-by-step create these things? So my main message, and I put it in capital letters to emphasize, is you need a plan. Okay, right? Jess Westerly did not have a plan. Daniela from Clothing and Accessories did not have a plan. Most of the time when these things sputter, it's because there wasn't a plan. I wrote you all some feedback on your Jess Westerly answers, and I think for most of you, at the end, made a point to say that going forward, what I want to stress is that these programs they need to be formal. They need to be structured. They need to be organized. It's not about sending an email. It's not about putting together a fancy PowerPoint and sending it to your boss. There's a lot of different things at work. I mean, look, Blanchard came up with 13 different characters on why something could go wrong. There's a lot of lines moving in parallel that you need to manage. It needs to be very organized. So that's what I'm going to be emphasizing a lot more going forward. And as the book correctly said, all these different disciplines need to work together. That you can't have commitment if you don't have accountability, and you can't have change just being held up by a leadership team doesn't help. It needs to be carried out in the organization. So all these different disciplines need to work together. And so, you know, pick any one of these things. Urgency, you can't have it without communication, sponsorship, and vision. Accountability doesn't work if you have too much delegation and not enough follow-up and consequences. Budget or misalignment with performance management can starve the program. So, you know, those are all things that I keep going back to Jess Westerly. She omitted all this stuff. She just thought, I've got a good idea, I've got facts and research to support it, I've got my boss encouraging me to do it, so I'm going to fire off this email, and by golly, this is going to work. And it didn't, because she wasn't very structured and formal with her process. So, for example, let's talk about urgency. We've been talking about it a lot. You got to establish urgency, 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 urgency. But my question to you is, how do you actually do that? You're Jess Westerly. You're new, you're young, you're a double minority or whatever they called her. You have no connections in the organization. You came from a competitor. You're American. But she knows, she's smart. She's an MBA. She took my class. She knows the first thing I need to do is establish urgency. Okay, but how do you actually do it? So, for me, it's about storytelling. You have to be able to tell a compelling story. Facts, spreadsheets, charts on a PowerPoint, that communicates something, but it leaves out a lot. So you need to tell the story. And I hate to support your business communications professor because she sounds, again, this is being recorded, she sounds tough. But but I agree. I think a successful change management owner or person like us, you need to be able to communicate in all the different forms. You need to stand in front of an audience and deliver a persuasive argument of the future and paint that vision of what the world will look like with change. You need to be able to write it down in an executive memo that you can send to C-suite people. You're not going to get 30 minutes to tell them the story, and you certainly wouldn't want to just send them probably a PowerPoint. At least in my company, the CEO, he reads memos. And there's a structure. If you call his secretary, they'll tell you you need to put it. It can't be more than 6 pages. It has to have an executive summary. I mean, there's a format, and you got to follow the format. But you need to be good at writing. You need to be able to articulate your points well in the written form. And then I think you guys need to know how to make a PowerPoint too. I take for granted business school students know how to make PowerPoints, but I work with a bunch of knuckleheads who don't know how to make PowerPoints, and it irritates me beyond all belief when my sales guys get up there and they're using, a completely white, unformatted PowerPoint with no template of any kind, and spacing and titles are way too big, and just God. I mean, so by all means, if you guys, just my recommendation to you. If you're not good at public speaking, go take a public speaking class. If you're not good with PowerPoint, take a PowerPoint class. If you haven't taken business communications and gotten yelled at by somebody, take that class. I think the best thing I ever did was I took an improv class. Not because I have some big desire to get into sketch comedy, but somebody recommended it to me, and improv is great. Has anybody taken an improv class? What was kind of the main takeaway for you?
Really thinking on your feet. So I also took it for work. Not that I have a love of acting at all. But I was finding in my sales role that if my client kind of threw something like out of left field, I would get sort of caught off guard and recover. Yeah. And so the thought was I want to get better at that recovery. And you can kind of throw anything at me, and I can kind of bring that person back.
So if you go down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama to talk to the factory workers about a Toyota Six Sigma program that they're going to be resistant of, I can imagine you're going to get some stuff thrown at you, questions that might catch you off guard. So having that skill set of being able to recover is pretty valuable. Jason, did you learn something?
Yeah, it taught me how to not take everything so seriously, laugh at yourself, and once you kind of relinquish some of that need for everything to be perfect, perfectly articulated, you're just a human being. Yeah, that tends to help.
I mean, it's silly, right? You and 7 people standing around, and you're lifting a giant manhole cover. And you're thinking, oh, this is so dumb. The thing that it taught me was how to listen. when you take an improv class, you learn how to listen because you have to build upon the last thing said by someone. The worst thing you do in improv class is say no. The rule is you say yes, yes and. So you have to listen to what someone said. You're in a dentist's office and he's got the gas on your mask. You don't say, no, 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 I'm actually in a barber shop. I mean, then the whole thing is ruined. You say, oh, yes, and I grabbed a scalpel and I started, so it forces you to be a good listener and to build on whatever is thrown at you. So thinking on your feet is about thinking on your feet based on what someone just says to you. So you have to really learn how to listen. And so I'd say when you're out there in the organization, when you're trying to build your credibility, it's face-to-face. It's got to be face-to-face. It's face-to-face. It's one-on-one communications, so face-to-face is best. A single phone call. I mean, look, we live in a world now where people like to email, people like to text. I mean, you can see it in my office, the generations. The old people pick up the phone. The people in their 40s do a lot of emailing. The young people text each other. Face-to-face communication is becoming a lost art. And you need to be able to do that to really connect with people and touch them and move them forward. Yeah.
I was going to say, so in my current role and in previous roles, I've actually kind of had to do all of these things. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think is interesting is doing all this upfront actually takes a lot of time and planning, especially when you're thinking about framing out, and trying to be persuasive and thinking about especially those face-to-face or those one-on-one or small groups, and you're trying to frame up what you're trying to discuss and what makes sense to them. This part to me is really important, but it's also can be time-consuming.
Very time-consuming.
Put sometimes as much time into this part because it really sets the precedent.
No, people don't put time into this. You just take for granted that you can communicate to people in masses. That's the email fallacy. Oh, I can get this message out to 100 people with one click of the button. To go try to have 100 face-to-faces, take a year. I can't do that. But what I'll tell you is your success will benefit so much from having these one-on-one conversations and these face-to-faces. And especially if as you do your planning, you have this idea and you pull someone aside and you say to them, hey, I've got this idea for this change program. What do you think? I mean, number one, you've established that personal connection that maybe you didn't have before. Number two, you've brought them into the joint diagnosis, so then eventually that'll be easier to win them over because they felt like they participated in it. Number three, you can get a sense of who's going to resist and who's not going to resist, and whoever you talk to might say, hey, I'm on board with this, but Lori down the hall, she's going to hate this. So then you start to do your due diligence. Oh, okay, so this person's is a supporter, but that person's a resistor. And then if they give you information, you can then use that to go to the next person, and then you can even sound more informed. Hey, I've already talked to John. John told me X, Y, Z, and then you don't. So then, if you're Jess Westerly, you can start to very quickly establish your credibility because you started to form your knowledge base by having all these one-on-one conversations. So for me, this is time very well spent. And I guess in that first case we read, the one about the clothings and accessories, they make a point to say that Daniela, or whatever his name was, he went and he met with everybody. He said by after 30 days he had met with everybody individually and even knew all their names. And there's a reason why the case suggested he did that, because that's, that is a good move. It's a good move just to, now he probably didn't do as good of a job winning over their support, but he did the right thing, but he took time to go and meet with every single person in his organization. So I highly recommend that. My other point here is that if you're Jess Westerly and you have no credibility, understanding your sources of power or lack of power, try to build your credibility by bringing in somebody along with you. So, she mentioned Tim Roeder. Well, you probably got an email from Tim Roeder in her email, but I mean, that doesn't do it, right? I mean, if she goes out to meet with these regional sales directors, she should try to get Tim to come with her, sit next to her in the meetings. If she has telephone calls, have Tim maybe join her in and say, hey, I just wanted to make the introduction. This is the sales director from Asia. I wanted to make the formal introduction with our new employee, Jess, so I'll turn it over to her and sign off. But just even that, being on the phone for 30 seconds now suddenly legitimized who this new employee was. So, again, going back to that case, understand your source of power, and if you don't have any, try to borrow some from somebody else. But in order to create that urgency, be able to tell a persuasive story, and I suggest you try to do it face-to-face or at least one-on-one. Okay, Cotter says number 2 is you need to form this guiding coalition, and Audrey had a good point about, well, who is this coalition? Is it a project team? Is it a steering committee? Is it change leadership team in the book? I mean, whatever you want to call it. Again, if I'm Julian and you know that there's a bunch of changes that need to happen in your hospital, and you know that you need to form a group, how do you actually do it? How do you actually form this group? Well, number 1, you talk to people one-on-one, right? I guess you either introduce yourself or you connect with people. But I think you probably start with the most influential person that you think will benefit you. So like I said, figure out who that person is, try to talk to them, get them on board. If you think they're going to be a resistor, don't waste your time, just move on to somebody else. But if you can get that person, then things will go probably a lot smoother. But because sometimes people will say, well, who else is involved in this? They say, oh, if Charlie's involved, and they go, oh, Charlie, okay, he's the executive VP of manufacturing. Okay, if he's on board, then this must be a good program. So again, people look for authority figures, but try to find that person and then incrementally build out the base. Figure out who are the connectors in the organization, who are the people who have influence. Try to determine, hey, I really want to get the nursing department involved, so you know what, Jill is the most popular person in the nursing department, so I'm going to get her on the team because she can then win over the support of everybody else. So try to figure out who these people are. Again, it's a little bit about figuring out their power of charisma, power of information, power of rewards or punishment. Try to identify who the people would be and talk to them one-on-one and see if they're willing to join on. And try to anticipate the resistance. Again, talk to people to figure out who's not going to like this, who's going to be the resistors to the key account manager concept. Who are the people with a lot at stake who won't like it? And then try to, as I say, try to remove these people from the beginning, if possible. Sometimes, so if you're in more of a position of authority where you can control maybe some of the organization, try to move people into different job positions to minimize them. I had that happen where we have this lab up in Michigan, and it's a small lab. There's only about 6-7 people up there, and they do all our research and development, and it's costly. R&D is costly, and I felt like rather than them being on my budget and having them on my line, my operational line, I would rather them link up with the global R&D group. So there's a global, it's called global R&D, but it's basically Europe R&D, but there's a couple research centers in Europe. And then there's one in Asia and there's one in North America. And the one in Asia and the one in North America are on the books and in the line of the 2 regional organizations. And then the cluster of them in Europe are somewhat separate. And I just thought, they're a little bit of an island, and they're fighting for resources, and they don't have the close collaboration that they need, so I would rather them just be an offshoot of the global center. And so I was trying to argue that we should essentially reshift their reporting line to be that way. And the guy who was the most vocal critic, driving me crazy, I reassigned him to be in the field as a director of technical support. So then he visits all of our customers and helps them troubleshoot. And I pulled him out of the lab And that way, when we did the restructuring, he, of course, voiced his opinion, but he wasn't even part of that organization anymore. So he didn't resist as hard as he would have if he was still sitting in that role. So sometimes reorganizing to get rid of the resistors is a smart move if you have that power and that authority.
When you moved the guy to the director role, is that a promotion?
No, he was already a director.
Okay.
Yeah. That happens sometimes, right? You promote the agitators. But he still reports to me. He reported to me before, he reports to me now. So it's not like I was able to promote him away, unfortunately. Okay, this is the one we talked a little bit about. How to establish that clear vision and to communicate it. There's a good example in the book that you'll read on this, My Iceberg is Melting, about this penguin who discovers this thing is happening, and he's trying to persuade this high council of other penguins to follow his thinking. How do you establish this clear vision? It's easy to say on paper, oh, you just establish a clear vision and communicate it. Okay, but how on earth do you do that? I mean, it's a little bit esoteric, it's a little bit high level. Vision stuff usually comes from the top office and you're somewhere in the middle. But like I said, to me, this isn't vision about words on a wall on a chart. This is about trying to make people who are affected by the change understand what the future state would be, or what are the consequences of staying with the status quo. So I think in general, again, it's about storytelling. And I think it has to be simple. And it has to be broad. And you need the two-way communication. Involve the people who it affects in the vision process. And again, don't lean too heavy on the numbers and the spreadsheets and the Jess Westerly, the quantitative analysis with the flow charts and the graphs and all that. The thing that's going to persuade people is the more emotional aspect. Hey, if we do this, we will be the -- in our industry at doing this. Hey, if we do this, we're going to create an amazing future for all of our customers, or whatever it is. Try to tap into the emotional part of the vision, not just the numbers. And for me, back to the plan, back to the formalization, back to the structure, make it the organization. Try to make your communication ritualistic. Get on the agenda at meetings. Hold periodic conference calls. Hell, send out newsletters. Newsletters are kind of corny, and they're not good at winning people over, but just to keep everyone aligned with the momentum, use every channel. I mean, so I'm not against using email. Just don't use email to kick off a program. But by all means, use email, use phone calls. If you have a signature title on your email and you carve yourself out as, the change management leader for your program, and your program will have some sort of a name. What was the name someone tossed out earlier?
Project
Atlas.
Atlas Steering Committee.
So Jason could put on his email, Jason Fitzke, Director of Risk, and underneath of it, Project Manager, Project Atlas. I mean, just every time he sends an email, someone will see that and they'll kind of go, oh yeah, Project Atlas, Project Atlas. I mean, be ruthless in your communication. I think in the book they said that the problem with communication was they weighed the importance of that first time. Hey, the first meeting or two was very good and very formal, and then you disappeared. Communication has to be constant and has to be two ways. And then Cotter says we need to align incentives, encourage others to act. I also, earlier we were calling this about, we were saying aligning incentives, and then later he was saying empowering others to act. Same thing. There's a lot of different things you can do here. Again, I think this is something that happens more in the middle phases, but you can look at changing organizational structure, like I was just talking about, and reporting lines. You could look at changing job titles. Sometimes people feel restricted by job titles. If you're trying to move toward, gaining market share, Sometimes people will say, well, if we're going to be, number one in market share, then, maybe we can't also be number one in product quality. And you say, yes, of course, they can be hand in hand, but, maybe it means, changing the vision statement that way. Maybe it's like, hey, you know what? We're going to be number one in quality and number one in market share. So formalizing these things a little bit. Compensation systems, rewards, okay, maybe we talked about it. Promotion opportunities, sometimes you promote agitators to get them away, but generally, use these as opportunities to get, there's an old saying that companies tend to put their best people on their biggest problems, but the old saying goes, you should put your best people on the biggest opportunities. So if there's a change management program, clearly that's got to be an opportunity. Try to get your best people on it. And then, be aware of the cultural identity. There might be a bunch of organizational context and history that maybe you don't even know about. Maybe sales and manufacturing have traditionally clashed. Maybe their bosses used to hate each other, and there's just a culture of non-cooperation. And so then you, as a young change management person, walk in there and just assume that, hey, we're all on the same team, we should all work together. And people go, oh, listen, buddy, you obviously haven't been here the last 10 years. We don't do that. You got to break those barriers. So, this is important, but this is more in the middle phases. And obviously, depending on your status in the organization, you're going to need upper level support for a lot of this. You're going to need people who with titles. Yeah.
Just curious, what did you do with that team to adjust their KPIs so that your Kentucky plant that it will not conflict?
So we have KPIs, which are what drives bonuses and compensation, and then they also have what they call PIs, which are just performance indicators. And so what we did was we installed a bunch of PIs that were basically my PIs, and for them, they're still, so we have 7 plants across the world. We have 2 in the US, we have 5 in Europe, and everything is set up to be standardized. So if I changed their KPIs, it would screw it up because then they'd be measured on something different than the European plants. So everyone has the same KPIs, but when it comes to their compensation, I think 8 of the 12 KPIs count, and then they have 4 PIs that are more my PIs count. So that there is no compensation conflict for them to pursue my strategy. But I tried to argue for them just to change their KPIs, and I was told by Europe, you can't do that because they're all measured and they're all benchmarked, so we just can't do that. Short-term wins, that's one that we're always mentioning, and it's important. What I say is start small and manageable. Set goals. So when you set up your plan, let's say your plan is 52 weeks long, and let's say after 15 weeks you have a goal. Your goal is to, get 3 accounts merged to this key account role. Once you have those 3 accounts merged, document it, send it out to everybody, celebrate it, congratulate the folks that worked hard at it. Start to build that momentum. So this is part of the planning process. Is don't just wait for something to dawn on you. Oh, hey, this was kind of a good milestone. We should, actually set the goal ahead of time. What do we want to achieve by week 10? What do we want to achieve by week 20, by week 30, by week 40? And I hate to say sandbag, but make them easy to achieve, at least early on, so that you have something to publish and something to celebrate. And again, these little non-monetary rewards, congratulate people for doing a good job. Congratulate people for being on track. Congratulate them for buying into the future. That goes a long way. And then we say spread the word and maintain the momentum. This is really in the final phases of a project, right? This is the maintenance phase. This is when things tend to fall apart. As I think the article says, it's time to call off the troops. And once you call off the troops and everybody retreats back home, then everything starts to regress back to where it was in the beginning. So, this is one where at this point you hopefully have changed maybe some reporting and compensation structures. You have all your incentives aligned. You set up performance management systems that incorporate the new changes. You have HR reviews, which also have as a component some sort of measurement on the change program. Sometimes whole groups or organizations get spun off. I think we talked about this from that original, the four frames. There was this, what do they call it? Environmental adaptive. So maybe through the change management program, you've realized that there's this shadow organization that you've populated with people that are on board and they get it and they see the future and they're well performing, and maybe they end up getting carved out as a separate business unit. New business development or whatever it might be. That's maybe more akin to or more likely in big organizations. In small companies, that's probably not going to happen. But I've seen that happen where we carved out in our company, we carved out a team focused on automotive because we were trying to make a big push into automotive, and they were just a subset of the regional. We do our sales and marketing by geographic region, but we decided to carve out a specific end market because it just needed to be treated a little bit differently. And then once we built it up, we decided, let's just keep it that way. Let's not merge it back into East and West or whatever. So we actually now have, sales East, sales West, and sales automotive. It just made more sense to do it that way. But that started from a change program where we determined that organization was high performing and worked really well. So, those are the things that I want you to start thinking about. I want you to start thinking about, as you are faced with this daunting task and you have this clean canvas in front of you, how do you start to do these things? It's really easy just to say, I just need to go create urgency. I mean, that's not easy. Creating urgency is hard. How do you actually create urgency? I need to form a guiding coalition. How do I form a guiding coalition? But I think at the end of the day, it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of influence and persuasion. It's a lot of structure and organization and planning and due diligence. And again, if possible, you really want to start slow and start small. Sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes it's something urgent, something that has to happen now. Back in 2009, the financial crisis dictated a lot of quick change programs because literally profits were going off a cliff. But every situation is different. But I would say in general, as Ivy said, not enough people spend time on that upfront work. You got to really be pretty formalistic and ritualistic about even talking to people. I mean, you just think, I just talk to people. But, you need to know who to talk to, where you're going to meet them, set up the appointment, what are my discussion points, what do I want to get out of the conversation, who am I going to talk to next, can that person help me connect to the next person? It's very structured. So the simulation you'll do next week starts to dive into this even more. You've got to convince, I think it's probably about 25 people to join your change program. And you have all these different tools in your toolbox to do it. And then how long, you have a deadline and you have only so much credibility. And it'll be interesting to see how you guys progress on it. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back at 8:30 and we'll bring in our guest speaker.
So the simulation, each individual is doing it, or are we doing it as a team?
Individual.
I was just going to say, because anybody who wants to come to campus, we could be in the MBA lounge if we were doing it.
Well, you can collude, I guess. I don't mind. I don't know that it will help you, honestly, but you can try it.
You set it up to compete live against one another?
I'm not sure if you can track each other's progress, but I will end up getting results, and then of course I'll show everybody. So, how you perform will, I will shame you if you do a bad job, but no, you'll do fine.